competing in, we are repeating in, we are believing in. It's time for us to shift our mind from best in the world to best for the world. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. It creates a new world to mind a shift, intentionality, perceptuality, conceptuality. We are choosing to shift our mind to best for the world, best for our world. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional.
Welcome to FiDE, Foundation for Intentional Decisions, and also Latin for Trust. My name is Stellan Nordahl, and I do this broadcast together with my colleague Jens Rinelt. Welcome, Jens.
Thank you, Stellan. Good to be here and to explore on this journey together with you. And what we are going to explore today are the four loops. And what are the four loops? What do they mean? How do they fit into the FiDE program, into the aspects that we are going to explore in these 10 episodes? And how have they actually developed? I think that's a good maybe starting point for where do they come from? What is actually a loop? Stellan, can you give us some input on that?
Definitely. And talking about loops, we have to have some kind of idea on what that is. So, of course, it's very crucial for talking about those. I would say you can call them learning loops. It was actually something that was introduced already in 1991. In that case, the second loop learning, which was a guy called Chris Argyris. He wrote a book talking about teaching smart people how to learn. Yeah. So it was about not only learning itself, it was how do we learn. So that was the second loop on how to learn.
So that is actually already the second loop. If you spend a minute on exploring this, what does it really mean? It's like instead of not only talking about what we are doing, he basically describes how do we do it, right? So if I understand you correctly, and that is two loops of learning, not looking at what I'm actually learning topic-wise, what I'm exposing myself to, what I'm exploring and learning, but also how do I do it and how do I approach the topic actually.
Yeah, definitely.
How to learn to learn, I think was one of my teachers always said.
Learn to learn, and that's very interesting in the topic of learning, of course. If you're a teacher in a school or a pupil in a school, a student of some kind at university level. When I was studying in the university, we talked also about how to learn and what was a good study technique. That was how it was expressed at that point. And that was approximately when Chris Argyris presented this idea. And you can look at it on how you do something. When I came into the knowing of the second loop and the third loop, which is also presented already beforehand, it was in a conversation with Pontus Rystedt, which is also one of the creators of the fourth loop. And at that point, when I came into contact with Pontus for the first time, it was because he was working in innovation, which is also a form of learning and learning new things, of course, but one could say that what Chris Argyris presented was very interesting, talking about how you learn. But then there is a third loop, which was introduced in 1996 in a book called Diversity Management by Robert L. Flood and Norma R. Romm. And what they did was talking about a third level of learning and innovation, maybe we can call it also, but a third loop of learning, was the triple loop learning was what they called it. And then you're talking about what is learning itself. What is the concept of learning? What is the concept of innovation? What is a human? That's very interesting.
So it sounds very interesting in the way, especially I guess in the sense of innovation, because what I'm understanding from this triple loop learning is actually, why do we learn? What is the and then how can we look at things not from a different perspective, right? From a different angle, and that is often where we found new insights, often where we find this innovation, because we are now seeing things from a different perspective.
And in some of the previous programs we have done here in the FiDE series, we talked about the tree metaphor. And I would like us to stay with the tree metaphor for a while, because what very often is seen is in the second and third loop learning, or third loop innovation, or whatever we call it, it's a linear structure. So what I want us to do for a while is to explore how can we see the connection between a linear model and a non-linear model as the tree metaphor. So if it's okay with you, I would like to stay for a while with the tree metaphor, which we presented early on in one of the previous episodes. This is a so-called theory of everything by Ken Wilber, called Equal, All Quadrants, All Levels. And what we see here is that we have in the upper left corner what is very often seen as the behavior. And for a person, which is on the left side in this model, it's also in a work context, it's competence level and work task and stuff like that. And we went through this in this episode. So if you want to know more about it, you can go into to one of those episodes and find the tree metaphor. And then there is the organizational, or the group level, or what can you call it, context level of it. Then it's structure and systems, it's tooling and equipment, and very often we find financial results or budgets or plans and stuff like that. And then below the surface, or beneath the surface, there is like a cultural level of everything. From the personal side, it's about personal values, work engagement, leadership, and so on. And on an organizational level, core values, maybe a shared vision, and so on. So this is a non-linear model, and if we use that for a while to look into what can we call it, a linear model, we have to be able to see that there is some kind of similarity with the non-linear model. So in this case, we have taken the equal model and laid it down, and then we have this quite simple linear structure where it goes from beliefs via thoughts to behavior, and it's out in the actions that we interact with each other. That is how we are being taught, and in that linear model there is an outer and an inner world which are separated, which we talked about in also one of the previous episodes.
Yeah, and what I think is important here to realize is that Ken Wilber says in his equal model that everything happens at the same time. So all aspects, which you just described, are basically happening at the same time. So it is not as if you would look at the first loop, second loop, or third loop, or what you described right now, the beliefs, thoughts, and behavior, they are not going from one end to another end and then back and forth, and this is how we think. Our thinking maybe influences our behavior, and then we can see the behavior and work on our thinking of how we approach it, which is basically the second learning loop.
And we can put in, and actually before we can actually add the loops, the first, the second, and the third, so that people can can relate to them. There you have them, the whats, the hows, and the whys. And this is quite interesting because this is also a connection that has been made previously to the fourth loop, and connecting this to more or less start with why, and Simon Sinek's ideas on how an organization can inspire, and how leaders can inspire.
And what I wanted to add here is that even though it seems like we're going through this linear model by first becoming aware of our behavior, and then about how we approach learning or our behavior with our thoughts, and then we become even aware of the third loop, reflection of our beliefs, at some point where you realize, even though it seemed like a linear model, that it's not. Then you understand that everything is happening at the same time. And I think that doesn't mean before it didn't happen at the same time. It's just at some point you become somehow aware of, oh, actually everything is happening at the same time.
And at the same time, it's a linear model that we have been taught. We were told that there was an outer world which was measurable and objective, and that there was an inner world which you couldn't measure, and that was subjective. But that we also explored in the first episode, actually, in this program, where we realized that this at some point we have mistaken an inner metaphysical subject idea for being an outer objective reality, which is quite odd when you say it, because it's like we have based the whole Western society upon this idea, a metaphysical idea, which we have then believed in so much that we think that is actually a truth in itself. And if we want to explore that more, please go to episode 1 in this series, and we have a deeper conversation on that. Also introducing new ideas on how to look at the outer and inner world, and should we even separate it.
So we have now a complex worldview and a non-linear outlook and description. But so far we have only talked about the 3 loops.
That's right.
So you and Pontus, our colleague, you have been working on actually the 4th loop, and
that's right. So, and we can add that now to description. And the background for that was that with intentional decision as a model for being aware that there are choices, and in the next step having it as an ethical framework for our choices, and when we are chosen, then get the effect of that choice. It implies itself there is a fundamental assumption when in this model when you present it, and that is that there is always a choice. And if that assumption is on some level at least relevant or right, or whatever you can call it, then not only the physical materia is fundamental, also some kind of a conscious agent or a consciousness in itself would be fundamental. Not excluding the materia, but adding on to it in some sense. Exactly how, we don't know. And this is also that is something that has been studied in theoretical physics and for a long time. And I would say is within cosmology something that is also seen as the hard problem, because if the story that we were told that the only thing that exists is what we see, then there is a problem with consciousness itself, because the hard problem is and that we explore also in the first episode, the hard problem is that you need consciousness to be able to talk about consciousness. At the same time, it's supposed to be arised by some kind of a complex structure. So intentional decision itself implies that there is a fundamental level called consciousness, and that means that everything that we are talking about as truths, more or less, are assumptions. And this is what you can actually see with the intentional decision model, that there is a a root metaphor for how the world is created. And for very long in the Western world, this root metaphor has been the machine metaphor, giving a rise to efficiency, of course, so effective way of working. We measure stuff, and what is not being able to measure is not existing. So what we realized is that we need a new metaphor. And while we got this idea, Pontus and me, we also realized that everything that we hold as true could be seen as assumptions. And can we choose new assumptions for pretty much everything? What will then happen? It doesn't say that the previous ones were wrong, more that maybe it could be another one. So this will be a root level and a fourth loop of, we can call it learning, or fourth loop of innovation, but also a fourth loop of how we decide upon stuff.
I mean, you mentioned a lot of things here, so let me try to figure this out a little bit and then dive deeper into these things. We will have, in an upcoming episode, we will dive a little bit deeper into the fundamental assumptions. But what I'm interested in right now is what are some of implications of the metaphor you have described, of the machine metaphor? And you already mentioned the industrialization that is basically built upon this, because we have created a tremendous efficient output. We have seen the rise of plants in the way of production plants, factories. That's the word I was looking for, factories. And as you said, famous quote also, you only can manage what you measure. So it has helped us to come to a very efficient way of managing or also producing things. But right now, I think we see ourselves in due to the COVID-19 situation find ourselves in a situation where everything that is not really sustainable is breaking down, and that is what we believe is the sign of that a new metaphor is emerging or is relevant, or as you would put it, I guess, that we have to choose a different way, a different metaphor of how we look at the world.
And when we do so, everything changes, as you said previously, that Ken Wilber also, when we presented the tree metaphor, he said that everything happens at the same time, more or less. And if we again take this picture, which I just put forward, the fourth loop, you see here that we are, in some sense, try to put the tree lying down to be able to even talk about it, because there is a problem with a liner model when you want to go to a non-liner one. Another way to show that is actually talking about two different models. A liner having, we can call it 4 levels or 4 loops or whatever we call it, and a non-liner where we realize that at every point in the tree there is the whole tree. So it doesn't separate itself. It doesn't separate the whats and hows from the whys and the roots. It doesn't say inner and outer or anything like that. It actually says that there are functions that are mainly seen in a what or in a how or in a why or in a root, but it all contains all parts of the tree. And this is actually what happens in a tree metaphor, that everything is present at the same time. And even if you can or cannot measure something, it doesn't exclude it from being real. I mean, to be honest, the only reality I can actually experience is what I really experience as reality. That should be denominated real, and it can't be compared to some other realities. It could be more real or less real or whatever it is, but it has to be either real or not. And I would say what I experience as reality is real for me. So so this is what the tree metaphor is actually doing here. It's presenting a more holistic, we can say holistic way of talking about a person, an organization, or a society. or the world itself. And when you talk about here, it gets me a little bit curious, because not only curious, also eager to let's decide upon this, because the last weeks or maybe months, as a society or a world, we have actually developed maybe 10 years or 15 in consciousness. And that's very interesting. What was totally impossible half a year ago is happening now.
Yeah, and I need to think of the name of the program, FiDE itself, because I think that is one of the, I would say, core assumptions or beliefs that hasn't been seen so much in the way we live and organize. So trust hasn't been really one of the organizing or guiding principles to design the systems that we have nowadays. I mean, for example, if we would have trust, then we wouldn't have to write down anything. If you would trust me, and if I would trust myself, I would only say the things that I believe I can deliver. I would only say to you, what I can do, and we wouldn't have the need actually to write it down and afterwards to kind of prove that we had this agreement.
No, that's right, and not in that sense. Maybe we have to put it down so we can remember or we can control afterwards, but not in sense of controlling, more checking, not checking in terms of controlling, more. If you have a quality system, for instance, is it there to emphasize and leverage, maybe to even amplify trust, or is it there to control trust as something that is not really trustworthy? Are you really trustworthy? Are you there to actually to do what you said you were going to do? So I believe this is extremely interesting moment in time, and I'm so glad that we can experience this, and also taking part in the choice forward, and to decide upon what society do we want to build, and what paradigm do we want to amplify.
Yeah, and then as soon as you said, I'm eager to test this, or to co-create actually this new society, it brings us back to the complexity. So what happens really if we choose different assumptions? What happens if we choose different routes? And at the same time as we do it, it will have an effect on our beliefs, on our thoughts, and our behavior.
Yeah.
And maybe it takes a time to be implemented or to be realized, but that doesn't mean it is really going through a linear process from roots to behavior, but everything happens at the same time. And the level of the awareness of how it is spread into all these areas takes a moment, because sometimes we need time to adjust to new belief systems. We need to train ourselves in the habits of new beliefs, get ourselves familiar with new assumptions.
Definitely, and we can look, for instance, you said earlier here that now COVID-19 has shown us what organizations and what companies and what societies are sustainable and what are not, or resilient, or whatever we call it. It brings me into thinking of, in a previous episode also, we dug into the intentional decision model, and we did it from the tree metaphor perspective or perception. So just to recall that, we could also look at sustainability itself. What happens if we talk about sustainability in a certain belief system? And the next picture we're going to look at is actually the intentional decision model seen from a perception of those trees. And in this we have, of course, there are many worldviews that could be relevant, but in this picture we have 4, which I believe is very relevant, because it's. We went through this, so if you want to dig deeper again, please go to a previous episode on this, on the intentional decision model. But just to recall it a little bit, we have the first tree to the right here in the picture. It's, for you who listen to this, it's a tree which is only able to see crowns, its own crown or other organizations or societies or persons' own crown. We can call it a system, and it measures everything in types of results. So the what level is what is present, and then we have the next one. We call it the formal we. It also acknowledged the how level, which is relevant for the second loop, of course. So you can actually see that there is some kind of a how, but you also you must be able to also choose a new how to be able to actually see this. And if you're at this level of consciousness, or whatever we call it, you can also realize that the physical me in this case, or they have a how, but they are not aware of it.
It's interesting because in all 4 stages there's a whole tree. It's not just the crowns. So even the tree only recognizes the crown. Maybe in other trees there is still the whole tree.
Yeah, but there's a very limited causality, of course, because the causality is only in the parts that you recognize or that you are aware of. So you try to find a causality within that description. And for those 2 trees, the formal we and the physical me, again, the core assumptions or the fundamental assumptions here, or the root metaphor has been the machine, and in various forms. It has been the clock, it has been the machine, and now it's the computer, more or less. That's the language we talk about. That's how we have built our society, our institutions. School, for example, the ring the bell. It's actually what's happened in the factory. The bell is ringing, and you have to go in, and everyone has to start at the same point at the same time. You more or less check in at the same time. Why is that? We know from learning and from for instance, if we study how people learn best, it varies. Some people learn best in the mornings, others in the evenings, and so on. So, but the system itself, it starts at 8 a.m. or whatever it is, and it ends at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And this is interesting in itself, because the system itself is amplifying itself. So if you have such a worldview based on the machine metaphor, it will produce more of itself. So, for instance, what is your production date? That is how we are educated, and we are educated. It's not like exploration, it's an education. It's something that we are educated into. So there is a truth, and we are supposed to learn it, and we're supposed to even repeat it. So that's how you look at learning. And for the next tree there, it's called Created Together. Then there is at least some awareness of that there are roots. So there is something below the ground, and we can call it the why level, the purpose, whatever it is. And the 4th tree here is the conscious united, and we don't know how many trees there are in this wood, but at least we have found this, and it opens up for new assumptions, for finding a new metaphor. And we have now tried to use the tree as a metaphor for the for those 2 trees. That also limiting, of course. It's the machine is limited because it's limiting to see everything as a machine, and the tree is limited and limiting everything to be seen as a tree. So of course we are already, when we choose that metaphor, limiting what else. There could be a 5th, whatever it is, or a 6th, or whatever that would be. But that will come in 100 years or something. I don't know, 50 maybe, 30. I don't know.
And I think it's also interesting because we sometimes run into the issue of how can we explain this in a language that is really representing the essence of what we mean. And I'm always thinking, if we look, for example, at personal development as one of the areas where this could be applied, I heard a lot of people talking about the hardware and the software, and that from time to time we as humans also need an update on the software. And here again you see the you're trying to describe something which is very complex in itself with a mechanistic language. And there yeah, I mean, I think it's problematic in itself because it can never express the essence of what we are trying to explore here. So in some way, we have to also find new language, new
Yeah, that's right.
words to really describe, the deeper levels, the root levels, and what it contains.
Yeah, and definitely, and it also means that we have to give up some language in favor of new words or new expressions, but also redefine some of them. And again, let us look at what's happening within the area of sustainability, just to use one silo itself, because sustainability, if it's supposed to be sustainable, it can't be silos in itself. But that has actually happened. First time we talk about the sustainability, it was more or less in silos: profit, planet, people. And at some level, we realized that they are, separated. And to be able to see that, of course, is also some kind of a leap in consciousness. And the next one is when you realize they're related, and that is when the third and the second and third sustainabilities were more or less invented or known as first environmental sustainability, and then the social sustainability. But the interesting thing is that they were present all the time in some sense. But when I was a kid, there was like an instruction movie from the authorities here in Sweden where we live. When you went away in the archipelago, it was an instruction how you got rid of your waste. So you have to have some kind of an amount of stones to really get the plastic down to the to the bottom of the lake or bottom of the sea. So sustainability itself, the way we look at that changes at the same time we look at the world with new eyes. And so this is what's happening with everything, the whole language, every single word, every single what was previously known as a silo. You realize it, okay, I can't be in my silo. I can have my specialty, but it's related at least, and maybe also totally interconnected with everything.
And I guess that's where we speak about systemic solutions, working on the systemic level. If I'm thinking about the SDGs, you can't just pick one and then say I'm working, for example, on SDG 8, but by doing that I'm maybe working against all of the other SDG goals. So what you have to do is actually to take a systemic look by putting all of them on the table and say, how can we contribute to all of them at the same time?
And this is very interesting, and it's also something maybe we should have in a episode itself, how we can use this knowledge that you're actually talking about now, and connect the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, to a new way of looking at the world. What happens if we're not stuck in measuring any longer? If we leave that for instance, in favor of using principles or whatever we want to use instead of goals or whatever we call it. And that's very interesting because we know from complexity, theory of complexity, that if you reduce the system, you lose the power of the complexity and the system itself. So another way to work with it is to use heuristic principles, and you also need some kind of a framework or an assumptions that are enabling stuff instead of limiting stuff. So you put up rules not to hold things together, but to enable stuff, and that is what you can do with assumptions, and then you can use principles to both navigate and create in a complex system.
Yeah, and I think that is actually also the topic for the next episode, I believe, if I remember it right. Assumptions. What are the current assumptions that we have right now? What are the assumptions that we, I don't want to say want to choose, because it's that is more on a personal level, what I want. But
we
it's more, what we can choose, but also what is beneficial for the planet. Because we work for what is best for the world. So we should also choose life-affirming habits and life-affirming assumptions. And what are those assumptions? What could they be? This is something we will explore further.
Definitely. And if coming back to the fourth loop, thinking, that means that we can actually choose, as you say, those assumptions. And when we do so, everything changes in the rest of the tree. You enable new ways of thinking, new ways of working, and new ways of creating stuff. So you enable new whys, new hows, and new whats. All not only limited by the assumptions, but also enabled by the assumptions. So every assumption you do is both an enabler and a limiting. In some sense, every belief is a limiting belief, and getting rid of, or at least choosing something that is maybe more life-affirming, something that is, you said it as more. You didn't use the word good. What do you for the best for the world? Yeah. And also, I believe, giving both the person and the organization and the society a common direction.
I think that's something really interesting. Not only from a narrative perspective that unites us as humanity, but also what is the direction that is best for the world. Can we agree on this direction, and can we, identify this direction? That's something really interesting to explore further as well, I would say.
Yeah, and so we have upcoming episodes on this, of course, and it will be very interesting to explore it further. And I would also say that using the knowledge about the fourth loop enables us to have also not only a new way of looking at the world, but again, new ways of working, and also new innovations in the what's, new technology, new, whatever that is set free when you leave a belief that you have been stuck to for a long while. That opens up a lot of new possibilities, of course.
Yeah, and maybe to close the loop here, is because we started with talking about innovation and looking from a double loop learning on taking different perspectives. But what we are exploring here and have been talking about is really taking different assumptions, taking, you can say, a different belief system, a different worldview on how to look at the world. And that is not only a different perspective, but it's really a different perception. So you actually have different glasses on how to look at the world, and you can choose these glasses, and then, as we said, everything that we look at will look differently.
Yes, and when they do, it opens up again new possibilities and new ways to both be and to live and to explore and experience, of course. And many things are easily, more easily at least, understood if you have an experience of it. So hopefully we can also introduce ways to explore later on in coming episodes, and ways to engage in creating a new story of us. So maybe we should leave that for today and say thank you very much for both listening and viewing, if you're on YouTube or on Acast or podcast or wherever you are. If you want to listen on the rest of the episodes, both the ones that have been already presented and the upcoming ones, you find them on Radio Intentional Decisions channels. So we use the channels for Radio Intentional Decisions, and we have put together this episode for FiDE, 10 programs exploring the intentional decisions and the way forward together. So thank you very much, and bye.
decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. It creates a new world to mind a shift, intentionality, perceptuality, conceptuality. We are choosing to shift our mind to best for the world, best for our world. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional.